Today's book is Mr. Happy by Roger Hargreaves. Have you got your books? Are you ready? Well, let's begin. On the other side of the world, where the sun shines hotter than here, and when the trees are hundreds of feet tall, there's a country called Happyland. As you might well expect, everybody who lives in Happyland is as happy as a day is long. Wherever you go, you see smiling faces all round. It's such a happy place that even the flowers seem to smile in Happyland. And, as well as all the people being happy, all of the animals in Happyland are happy as well. If you've never seen a mouse smile, or a cat, or a dog, or even a worm, go to Happyland. This is a story about someone who lived there, who happened to be called Mr. Happy. Mr. Happy was fat and round and happy. He lived in a small cottage beside the lake, at the foot of the mountain and close to the wood in Happyland. One day, while Mr. Happy was out walking through the tall trees in those woods near his home, he came across something which was really rather extraordinary. There, in the trunk of one of the very tall trees, was a door. Not a very large door, but nevertheless a door. Certainly a door. A small, narrow, yellow door. Definitely a door. I wonder who lives in there, thought Mr. Happy to himself, and he turned the handle of the small, narrow, yellow door. The door wasn't locked, and it swung open quite easily. Just inside the small, narrow, yellow door was a small, narrow, windy staircase leading downwards. Mr. Happy squeezed his rather large body through the rather thin door and began to walk down the stairs. The stairs went round and round and down and down and round and down and down and round. Eventually, after a long time, Mr. Happy reached the bottom of the staircase. He looked around and saw there in front of him another small, narrow door, but this one was red. Mr. Happy knocked on the door. "Who's there?" said a voice, a sad, squeaky sort of voice. "Who's there?" Mr. Happy pushed open the red door slowly, and there, sitting on the stool, was somebody who looked exactly like Mr. Happy, except that he didn't look happy at all. In fact, he looked downright miserable. "Hello," said Mr. Happy. "I'm Mr. Happy." "Oh, are you indeed?" sniffled the person who looked like Mr. Happy but wasn't. "Well, my name's Mr. Miserable, and I'm the most miserable person in the whole wide world." "Why are you so miserable?" asked Mr. Happy. "Because I am," replied Mr. Miserable. "How would you like to be happy like me?" asked Mr. Happy. "I'd give anything to be happy," said Miserable. "But I'm so miserable, I don't think I could ever be happy," he added miserably. Mr. Happy made up his mind quickly. "Follow me," he said. "Where to?" asked Miserable. "Don't you argue," said Mr. Happy, and they went out through the small, narrow red door. Mr. Miserable hesitated, and then he followed. Up and up the windy staircase they went. Up and up, around and around, then up and around and up went. They came up into the woods. "Follow me," said Mr. Happy again, and they both set off through the woods back to Mr. Happy's cottage. Mr. Miserable stayed at Mr. Happy's cottage for quite some time, and during that time the most remarkable thing happened. Because he was living in Happyland, Mr. Miserable ever slowly stopped being miserable and started being happy. His mouth started turning down at the corners, and ever so slowly he started turning up at the corners. And eventually Mr. Miserable did something that he'd never done in his whole life. He smiled, and then he chuckled, which turned into a giggle, which then became a laugh, a big, booming, hearty, huge, giant, large, enormous laugh. And Mr. Happy was so surprised that he started to laugh as well. And both of them laughed and laughed, then laughed until their sides hurt and their eyes watered. Miss Miserable and Mr. Happy laughed and laughed and laughed and laughed. They went outside, and still they laughed. And because they were laughing so much, everybody who saw them started to laugh as well. Even the birds in the trees started to laugh at though somebody called Mr. Miserable who just couldn't stop laughing. And that's really the end of the story, except to say that if you ever feel as miserable as Mr. Miserable used to, you know exactly what to do, don't you? Just turn your mouth up at the corners. Go on, smile. The end.